Welcome back to the firewall class. This is the second part of our firewall lesson, and I just want to recap real quickly what we went over in the last class. Where we left off was we had set up everything in our firewall environment, in this case our Staro security gateway, and we went in and we created a packet filter rule that basically said that we were going to allow traffic from our internal network on which our Fedora virtual machine here is running. And we were going to allow HTTP port 80 traffic sourced from our internal network out through the firewall to any destination. In this case, any destination out on the internet. And we created the rule, made sure the rule was enabled. And upon going into Fedora, we went ahead and we opened up our web browser and attempted to browse out to the web. Now at this point, I thought I had everything set up properly. We come in and we wait for the page to load. We wait, nothing happens. Go in, let's try google.com. Let's see what happens there. Nothing happens, it just keeps turning and turning and turning. What could be causing this to happen? Now, in normal training videos, you'll watch it and everything will seem to go perfectly. That's not real life. That's not the real world. Anybody that's worked in the IT field for any length of time will tell you there's always something. You'll configure everything exactly how you think it should be configured. You think it should work, but you forget something. You forget one little piece or one little configuration option. That's the real world, and that's what's happened here. And so after that first training video, I sat back and I said to myself, what am I forgetting? And then it clicked. So what you're going to need to learn how to do when you're working with these types of things is you're going to learn how to troubleshoot. You got to think about, okay, what have I set up? What am I forgetting? Why doesn't it work? So in our example, if we go into our command prompt, well, we've got our system set up to query DNS queries. So if I do an NS lookup on google.com, we see, I'm getting answers. Well, why am I getting answers to my Google query, but I can't get to the website? Well, if you remember, we have our machine here pointing to the firewall to resolve its domain names. Well, so that's why I'm able to get the answers back, because I'm querying directly to the firewall, and I can ping our firewall. I can type in the IP address of it, and I'll get ping results back. So this shows that, okay, I can communicate as far as from my machine to my firewall. So let's see what happens if I ping google.com. I know I can resolve the name. If I hit enter, why can't I ping google.com? Why can't I get out to the internet? Well, the reason why is because I forgot in our little demonstration here that we're in a sort of a test lab environment. And this firewall, in normal situations, this firewall will be connected directly to the internet. Now, there is something that we use in networking, specifically when we're talking about protecting internal network systems from the internet. We use something called network address translation. And different systems will call it different things. In this case, Staro calls it network address translation. And they also refer to it as masquerading. So you'll hear it different ways. And as I sat back thinking about, okay, what's the problem? It hit me. Oh, I forgot about natting. And basically what natting does is it allows for the use of what are called private IP addresses on the inside of your network. And these are addresses that cannot be routed on the internet. And so what that basically means, what that basically means is that once that private IP address information hits the firewall in our situation, in our scenario, is going to see that, and it's going to say, wait a minute, this is a private IP address. I can't allow this to go out to the internet. Mainly because if it did, the routers that are out on the internet wouldn't allow it through. So what we have to do is we have to translate that internal network into an IP address that the internet recognizes as a public IP address, a valid internet routable address. And the way we do that is using network address translation, or masquerading. So that's the missing key here. What's happening is that our traffic is coming from the internal network. It's hitting the firewall, and the firewall can do one of two things. It could say, okay, I'm going to go ahead and forward that request, just like you said. If masquerading is not enabled, what's going to happen is that source IP address of our machine is going to go through the firewall and then try to go out through to the internet without being translated into something that the internet says is acceptable. So what we've got to do is we've got to go in here and we're going to create a new NAT rule, or a new masquerading rule, in our firewall. So I'm going to click here, and here's how this works. So basically in this section here, you're specifying, okay, who are we natting? Whose address are we going to translate? What's the source network address that we're going to translate? And in our situation, we're going to translate the internal network address. So you can see here, our internal network is represented by 192.168.58.0/24, which basically means that last octet there that says 0, that includes everything that's in our network, which is a .58 network. So anything in this particular network, we're going to translate to something. So for this position, it basically says what position in our list of NAT rules do you want this to be in. Since this is our only NAT rule, we're going to leave that setting alone. Now this interface setting here, and this will look different on different firewalls, but in this case, what this is saying is, okay, you say you want to translate this network's address. Well, who are we going to translate it to? Well, in this instance, we're going to translate it to our external IP address, the external interface's IP address. And basically what this is saying is that this address is going to go through the firewall, be translated into the IP address that belongs to our external interface. And so in a situation where this is a firewall that is on the network edge, in other words, this is the firewall that separates our network from the internet, we're going to have a publicly routable IP address that is associated with this external IP address, so that when the traffic flows through, it will be accepted by the internet as an acceptable public IP address. So that's what we're specifying here. Now, if this external interface had more than one IP address, we would be able to select it here. In this case, it only has one. And then we can add a comment right here. So I'm going to save this rule, this NAT rule, or masquerading rule. And you can see it represented here, what's going to happen. And then we're going to turn this rule on. So now that we have our NAT rule in place, and now that we've specified that we're going to allow traffic sourced from our internal network that is going out to port 80 to any destination, we've got both of those things in place. Now let's see if we can get out to a website. And here we're going to try google.com, and voila, it works. So that is something that you have to remember when you're setting up a situation where the traffic is going to go from the internal side of your firewall, out of the firewall, out to the internet, is that it has to know, the internet has to know that you're using a publicly routable IP address. And in most situations, you're going to use NAT in order to make that happen. Now, this all has to do with the fact that we use something called IP version 4, IP addressing version 4. Well, in the near future, we're going to start hearing a lot about IP version 6, where a lot of this natting stuff may not necessarily need to take place. But because there were a limited number of publicly routable IP addresses, engineers had to come up with a way to sort of conserve a certain number of IP addresses so that everybody could actually use the internet. So they came up with this scheme of private IP addressing and this idea of network address translation, which we've just shown here. So just to recap, yes, on the last lesson, we couldn't get out to the internet. Even though we had our packet filter in place, we needed something to translate our internal network into a publicly routable network address. And that's what we're using network address translation for. And then we successfully are able to browse out to the internet.